Welcome to Doctor Not Guilty, Series 6, Chapter 6, The Agents of Judgment. Throughout my life, I dedicated myself entirely to public service. School was not merely a duty, it was my sanctuary and my calling. I worked constantly in classrooms, hospitals, and research labs, driven by a deep hunger to serve, heal, and contribute something meaningful. For many years, I believed love could wait. I poured thousands of hours into studying internal medicine, psychiatry, and addiction medicine. I convinced myself that my personal life was secondary to the sacred duty of healing patients and building a meaningful career in academic and clinical medicine. Then, during a brief visit home to Syria in the middle of my medical residency, everything changed. I met my sister's best friend, a brilliant young physician named Douha Sabouni, who had attended the same medical school as I did. When she said hello, the world, just for an instant, felt like it completely paused. All the exhaustion of residency, all the noise of clinical rounds, and the relentless pressure of medical training seemed to fade away into the background. We spent 2 weeks getting to know each other, two overworked medical minds discovering shared dreams, shared ideals, and a shared sense of purpose. We talked about science, about medical ethics, about human suffering, and about our shared commitment to making a difference in the world. Her parents respected my family and gave their blessing with one condition. If the relationship were to proceed, it had to do so within the traditional bounds of engagement. I had no hesitation whatsoever. I asked, and she said yes, but our plans were suddenly disrupted by the catastrophic events of September 11th, 2001. I had intended to return to Syria just weeks after the attack to finalize our plans, but international air travel was completely suspended. Security protocols tightened nationwide, and I would not see her again until December of that year. Those months of separation tested our patience and deepened our resolve. When I returned, we wasted no time. We were married in a civil ceremony, and in the summer of 2002, shortly after graduating medical school, Douha joined me in Virginia. We were finally together, husband and wife, immigrants and physicians, building a life in a land still new to both of us. We faced the daunting challenges of navigating complex healthcare systems, rigorous medical licensing, and the unspoken barriers that every foreign-trained physician encounters in the United States. In 2003, we welcomed our first son, Nader. 2 years later, our second son, Nabil, was born, and in January 2013, we welcomed our third child, Zaid. Douha built a remarkable career in obstetrics and gynecology, remaining my rock, my partner in marriage, and my anchor in mission through training, relocation, childbirth, career changes, and eventually, the devastating storm of federal prosecution. She stood beside me when the full machinery of the federal government was turned against our family. To understand how a physician's family can be thrown into the crosshairs of federal law enforcement, one must look at how the government's approach to healthcare oversight has fundamentally transformed over the last 2 decades. Healthcare is no longer governed solely by clinical guidelines, peer reviews, or standard medical boards. It is monitored by vast data networks, machine learning algorithms, and criminal investigative units that view medical practice not as a human endeavor, but as a massive stream of transactional data points to be audited and mined. Pre-crime was once the language of dystopian fiction. Philip K. Dick imagined a future where suspects were arrested before crimes were committed, based on prediction rather than proof. What once belonged to fiction is now creeping directly into lived reality. In his famous narrative, 3 mutated individuals called precogs could visualize future murders before they took place, allowing law enforcement to detain individuals who had not yet committed any illegal act. From Minority Report to Blade Runner, Dick's stories warned humanity about surveillance, societal control, and the steady erosion of constitutional freedom. Today, government systems use sophisticated algorithms and predictive tools to monitor, predict, and prosecute citizens. In healthcare, clinical judgment, innovative patient care, and individualized medical decisions can be recast by bureaucrats as criminal deviation. Algorithms analyze billing codes, flag statistical anomalies, and treat complex medical care as financial crime. When an algorithm flags a medical practice, it does not evaluate whether a patient's life was saved or whether an impoverished individual finally received treatment for severe clinical depression or substance addiction. The algorithm simply measures numerical deviations from statistical norms. If a physician sees more high acuity patients than the regional average, or if a psychiatrist spends more time with complex dual diagnosis cases, the system flags the provider as a statistical outlier. In the eyes of automated oversight, a statistical outlier is indistinguishable from a criminal enterprise. The Office of Inspector General was created to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse in federal health programs like Medicare and Medicaid. Its mission may sound noble in name, but its methods raise severe constitutional concerns, especially when complex medical treatment is judged through the lens of institutional suspicion rather than clinical context. When auditors look at medical files through spreadsheets rather than patient outcomes, nuanced care is misconstrued as fraud. Enter the agents: Stephanie Yeager, Andrew J. Timoner, police officer Gretchen Kramer, and Austin Lestosky. These were not just names written in a federal indictment report. They were active instruments of the state, carrying extraordinary power into a physician's daily life, armed with search warrants, government authority, and the full weight of federal law enforcement behind them. When agents arrive, the constitutional presumption of innocence begins to crumble instantly. They do not enter quietly or politely. They bring the terrifying weight of the federal government, the absolute authority of law enforcement, and the unspoken assumption that if they are knocking on your door, you must have done something horribly wrong. The public, the media, and even colleagues immediately assume that federal agents do not act without cause. I remember the knock vividly. OIG agents stood at the door in dark jackets, badges flashing like coins of condemnation as they presented a search warrant with total clinical detachment. I gave them my attorney's contact information, invoked my Fifth Amendment right under the United States Constitution, and explicitly stated that I would not answer questions without counsel present. It was a terrifying moment for any professional who has dedicated their entire life to serving others. Standing in my own facility while uniformed and armed federal agents fanned out across the hallways was a surreal experience. Patients who had come in for help, vulnerable individuals struggling with severe psychiatric disorders, watched in shock and fear. The peaceful therapeutic environment built over years was destroyed in a matter of minutes. Staff members were pulled aside, questioned in isolated rooms, and subjected to coercive tactics designed to make them feel complicit if they did not immediately validate the government's prepackaged narrative. Still, they searched every room, and still, they gathered box after box of medical records, computers, and documents. Later in court, agents claimed under oath that I had made statements that painted me as guilty, distorting my calm demeanor and refusal to speak into evidence of consciousness of guilt. The official record became a fiction built not from verbatim transcripts or recordings, but from agent memory, selective interpretation, and institutional assumption. Unless you fight relentlessly to tell your own story, they will write it for you in indictment pages. The government's investigative methodology relies heavily on written 302 reports, which are summarized notes compiled by agents after an interview or search. These reports are not verbatim transcripts, nor are they audio recorded. They are subjective narratives written from the agent's perspective, often hours or days after the event. What you actually said is filtered through what the agent wanted to hear, creating an official document that fits seamlessly into the prosecution's theory of the case while omitting crucial contextual statements that would demonstrate innocence. Among the agents who entered my life, none stood out quite like Austin Lastowski. On the surface, he was remarkably calm, reserved, and methodical, asking questions with surgical precision and taking detailed notes with the cold detachment of someone assembling a complex machine. He did not raise his voice or show emotion, maintaining an eerie posture of neutral professionalism throughout the entire search procedure. Only later did I learn that Agent Lastowski was a trained behavioral analyst, which changed everything in hindsight. He had not merely come to gather physical facts or document electronic records. He had come to study me, to analyze my psychological reactions, and to interpret my tone of voice, natural pauses, body posture, and physical gestures against a pre-existing template of presumed guilt. Every movement was evaluated as potential deception. Imagine trying to remain composed when strangers armed with handguns and federal badges are going through your personal records, pulling down files, and treating your life's work as evidence of a crime. If you are angry, they record you as combative and uncooperative. If you are calm, they record you as cold, calculating, and lacking remorse. If you pause before answering to make sure you speak accurately, they record your pause as a sign of cognitive load and deceit. It is a psychological trap where every possible human response is interpreted as confirmation of guilt. Behavioral analysis draws on psychology, criminology, neuroscience, and linguistics. At its core, it involves the systematic observation of human behavior to assess intent, deception, or risk. It appears clinical, structured, and objective on its face, but its actual application in criminal investigations is far from harmless. It relies heavily on subjective interpretation disguised as hard science. One common investigative method is the behavioral analysis interview, which purports to establish a psychological baseline through ordinary, non-threatening questions, and then watches closely for micro-deviations when sensitive topics are introduced. Another technique is statement validity analysis, which examines verbal consistency, specific detail, cognitive load, and emotional leakage in spoken words. The profound flaw in these methodologies is that natural human fear, severe stress, and trauma look virtually identical to deception. When an innocent person is confronted by federal law enforcement, their heart rate surges, their body floods with adrenaline, and their nervous system enters a fight or flight state. They may falter in speech, dry up, fidget, or maintain intense eye contact while trying to understand what is happening. A behavioral analyst trained to look for deception sees these biological stress responses not as the understandable fear of an innocent person under siege, but as the telltale markers of guilt and deceit. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit helped integrate profiling and behavioral evaluation into federal investigations nationwide, and today that mindset extends far beyond violent crime into insider threat detection, healthcare fraud audits, cybersecurity, and complex financial investigations. Yet extensive scientific research and academic peer-reviewed studies have found that professional lie detection and behavioral profiling perform only marginally better than pure chance. Federal investigators are no better at detecting lie indicators than the average citizen, despite their training. Behavioral cues are heavily culturally variable and deeply context-dependent. Avoiding direct eye contact may be interpreted by a Western law enforcement officer as a classic sign of guilt or deception, whereas in many Middle Eastern, Asian, or indigenous cultures, it is a universal sign of respect toward authority. When subjective behavioral impressions are written into official federal reports without real-time rebuttal, they shape the entire trajectory of a criminal prosecution, turning innocent cultural norms or anxiety into evidence of guilt. In my case, as an American Syrian physician, my cultural background, formal tone, and careful demeanor were weaponized against me. What was meant as deep respect for law enforcement and legal decorum was recast by investigators as evasive maneuvering. This cultural mismatch in behavioral analysis is rarely acknowledged in courtrooms, yet it plays a devastating role in how minority professionals are evaluated and targeted by federal law enforcement agencies. Civil rights attorney Paul Hetznecker has spent decades challenging government overreach, illegal surveillance, and the systematic erosion of constitutional civil liberties. He has repeatedly warned that pre-crime is no longer a futuristic fantasy from sci-fi books, but the daily lived reality of citizens judged not for actual illegal actions they have taken, but for what state apparatuses fear or predict they might do. When government power operates on predictive modeling rather than concrete criminal acts, liberty is fundamentally compromised. Paul Hetznecker points out that when the state shifts its focus from investigating committed crimes to predicting potential wrongdoing, the entire constitutional architecture of the Fourth and Fifth Amendments is undermined. Search warrants, which were originally designed by the Founding Fathers to require specific, individualized probable cause of a crime already committed, are transformed into fishing expeditions powered by algorithmic probabilities. The government no longer needs proof of a crime to ruin a life. It only needs a statistical anomaly to justify launching an all-consuming investigation. Data-driven behavioral analytics claim to predict healthcare fraud by identifying statistical anomalies in medical charts, billing code distributions, and prescription logs. On the surface, this algorithmic approach seems scientific, objective, and impartial. But beneath that high-tech veneer lies a dangerous cascade of flawed logic, where statistical outliers are automatically classified as fraudulent behavior without regard to the clinical realities of complex patient care. These automated algorithms do not understand clinical context, medical nuance, severe psychiatric illness, or extraordinary patient need. They flag statistical deviations, feed automated alerts to federal investigators, and initiate aggressive scrutinies that can upend lives and destroy medical practices overnight. What follows next is one of the most dangerous psychological forces in any law enforcement investigation: confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the psychological tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and remember information in ways that confirm one's pre-existing beliefs or hypotheses while systematically ignoring counter evidence. In high-stakes criminal investigations, the effects of confirmation bias are truly catastrophic, transforming objective fact-finding into a targeted mission to validate an initial theory of guilt. Once a target has been identified by data algorithms or informant tips, investigators shape every piece of evidence around a narrative of guilt. Neutral or ambiguous evidence is viewed through a distorted lens of suspicion, while clear exculpatory evidence is minimized, dismissed, or entirely suppressed. In healthcare fraud investigations, every patient chart, every billed evaluation, and every legitimate prescription can be reinterpreted by non-medical agents as proof of a criminal conspiracy. For instance, if a doctor documents an extensive patient consultation, the investigator who assumes guilt will claim the documentation is overly detailed and thus fabricated to justify a higher billing code. Conversely, if the documentation is concise, the same investigator will claim it is insufficient and proves that services were never provided. Under the weight of confirmation bias, every fact, whether detailed or concise, present or absent, is twisted into evidence of wrongdoing. The core danger is not always conscious malice, but investigative methodology. Investigators may sincerely believe they are protecting the public interest, while their flawed assumptions create a self-fulfilling prophecy. When guilt is assumed at the outset rather than proven beyond a reasonable doubt through objective evidence, the justice system fails the accused, subverts the Constitution, and undermines the fundamental principle of equal justice under law. The human toll of this process cannot be measured purely in legal motions or courtroom transcripts. Behind every federal investigation is a family forced to watch their world shatter. For months and years, my wife Douha and our 3 children had to endure the persistent cloud of government suspicion. How do you explain to young children that federal agents entered your workplace? How do you maintain a medical practice and care for suicidal patients, severe addiction cases, and acutely ill psychiatric patients when your bank accounts are frozen and your reputation is under attack? The physical and psychological stress takes a massive toll on a family. Douha, juggling her own medical practice in obstetrics and gynecology, stepped up not only as a supportive spouse, but as a bulwark protecting our children from the emotional fallout. She maintained stability at home while we systematically analyzed thousands of pages of discovery, exposed inaccuracies in federal witness statements, and prepared a meticulous defense to challenge every single claim made by the government. The negative halo effect occurs when a single perceived negative trait or allegation completely taints how an entire individual is evaluated. For a practicing physician, a single billing inquiry, documentation error, or patient complaint can eclipse decades of selfless service, extensive humanitarian work, published academic research, and impeccable ethical care. The whole life of the doctor is reduced to the alleged infraction. One red flag triggers the negative halo effect, an institutional confirmation bias then cements it into an unshakable narrative. The investigating agent sees only what fits the indictment. The prosecutor constructs a courtroom story focused entirely on greed and deception. And the jury may feel the crushing weight of state suspicion long before the defense calls its first witness. True justice demands that society examine more than just a single shadow cast by authority. These combined psychological and systemic forces create an ecosystem where justice is not neutrally pursued, but guilt is structurally presumed. The intense investigative spotlight does not merely illuminate facts, it burns through professional reputations, destroys livelihoods, and inflicts severe psychological trauma on innocent families. When the Department of Justice issued press releases regarding my prosecution, they conspicuously omitted the standard disclaimer regarding the presumption of innocence that is routinely granted to other federal defendants. When public relations departments within law enforcement release press statements highlighting charges without emphasizing that the accused remains innocent until proven guilty, they orchestrate trial by media. The local community reads the headlines, professional colleagues pull back in fear, and the defendant's practice collapses before a single piece of evidence is tested in front of a jury. This strategy is designed to force defendants into plea agreements by destroying their ability to fund a legal defense or earn a living while awaiting trial. Fighting back against this system requires incredible resilience, deep constitutional understanding, and unwavering support from loved ones and legal counsel. Exoneration is not given freely. It must be fought for and won piece by piece, document by document, argument by argument. You must be willing to dismantle the government's artificial narrative by bringing objective facts, clinical reality, and unyielding truth into the courtroom light. This chapter is not merely a personal warning. It is an urgent plea to remain vigilant in an era increasingly governed by black box algorithms, unchecked surveillance, and pre-crime judgment. When the agents arrive at your door, they bring far more than questions. They bring a pre-constructed narrative, and unless you stand firm, exercise your constitutional rights, and fight with everything you have to reclaim the truth, their story will be the only one history records.